Okay, so now we've got a bunch of questions here about anxiety. I'm just going to read like the three. Is an anxious elementary school child destined to have real issues as a teen? That's one about anxiety. Another is sort of, you've talked a lot about the causes and symptoms of depression. Can you talk a little bit about other conditions that we should look out for, such as anxiety? And then a third one is, if the distress signals are very high or extreme and there's an actual diagnosis of anxiety, sort of where to go for assistance. So those are the three anxiety questions that I just pulled. Shashank.
There's a lot of anxiety about anxiety.
Yes.
So, as Neville said before, a little anxiety can go a long way. Okay, when we had our first child, I wanted my pediatrician to have a little anxiety to make sure that, like, that my kid was going to be okay, and because we weren't sure in the beginning, and he turned out to be okay, but in the beginning, or getting here on time, having a little anxiety. When is it too much? How do you know? Well, one of the education pieces we do in middle schools and high schools is a program from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention called More Than Sad. And the one we do with teens is called Teen Depression. And it depicts kids with different kinds of presentations in the classroom. One of them is very anxious. And it's the kind of person who is, basically it's causing problems. He's the every person's star kid. He's captain of the football team. He's someone who everyone goes to with their problems. He's known as a really good listener. He's a kind, sensitive, strong, liberated high school male. But man, he's anxious. And you see scenes depicted there where it really gets him down. He's talking about, he worries about grades, he worries about games, he worries about everything. So what this parent is describing is not unusual. We do have kids who sometimes, they don't have anxiety disorder necessarily, but they may have what's called anxious temperament. They may just be kind of a nervous person. So when do you take them to a professional? Well, with anxiety, I would say it's probably never too early or too uncalled for to go, for example, to the pediatrician to get it assessed and to get a sense for what is a professional thing, or to go to the guidance counselor, because most successful people have a little anxiety that sometimes gets out of control. And most of us can benefit from things that aren't necessarily things you have to go once a week for 30 or 40 weeks for. Things like mindfulness-based stress reduction. There's a lot of science now to support that as a medical intervention for anxiety that does not involve medicine, but actually changes the brain. It changes our sympathetic nervous system. It changes our overall health, and it probably changes our longevity. You can visit the website, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, and learn all about it. They have programs for children. Those principles are now things that are being taught in schools. They're very simple. They're things like breathing. They're things like moment-to-moment awareness, and they're things that actually help kids do better in school. There's actually science behind that too. We have put some selected resources out front. We did put a couple of books on anxiety there too, particularly for children in our clinic. One of the books we like is by someone named Ron Rapie. It's called Helping Your Anxious Child, a step-by-step guide, and it's really based primarily on something called cognitive behavior therapy, which is the idea that the way we think affects the way we feel, which affects the way we behave and interact. And so the way we can change the way that we feel about ourselves or about a situation or about the anticipation of a situation is to change the way we think about it. And so these kinds of books are nice guides for parents to be able to help their child. If you came to our clinic, we would very much involve you in the process in a cognitive therapy paradigm. Parents are coaches. They're part of the team. And if it's not a parent, if the parent is part of the problem in the child's eyes or the teen's eyes, then we might find a teacher, we might find a coach, or maybe one of the parents can be the primary person helping. But there's a lot of good books out there now. I'll just refer you to one more website that, again, is on this resource list that there's like several hundred copies out front. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry has something called Facts for Families. And they are these 1 to 2 page handouts with a lot of great information about what's normal, what's not, how do I know when to worry, and then what do I do about it? What are some good web resources and book resources that I can do as a non-clinician parent who just wants to support my child and figure out when I should go reach for help? And then the Academy of Pediatrics also has a really nice product called Bright Futures. And Bright Futures Mental Health is specifically designed by pediatricians and child psychiatrists so that we can help parents understand what's normal and what's not. And there's a link there in the resource guides on Bright Futures.
Okay, great. We've got a bunch of things here on sort of when to push, how to know when your kid should sort of tough out a bad situation versus make a change, or you've got a kid who really is too busy and says she's too busy, but she refuses to quit any of her activities. So when do you as a parent step in? How do you know when you should sort of step in and let them sort of tough it out or deal with it and figure it out on their own versus you stepping in? Let's have Neville weigh in on that.
Well, that's a tough one, and that's a personal call, I think. But if you feel that your child is suffering, and in more than one way, and in those three spheres, then sometimes you have to stand up. I think many of us, being parents, are a different generation of parents, and we have a hard time saying no, or asserting ourselves as well. And sometimes I think we need to be able to do that. We try and coddle our kids. I think I'm speaking for certainly my generation of parents who tried to do everything for their kids. And but sometimes you have to say no. You're going to have to drop such and such. And it's hard to do because you want the best for your child as well. But if that child is suffering, you have to make the stand.
Yeah. Be the parent.
You
We
have
hear
to be
that.
the parent.
Yeah.
And I think
You don't have a mic.
I think one of the principles I learned from one of our former postdocs who then came onto our faculty, Rebecca Rielon-Berry, she's now at NYU, but she used to talk about, she did a lot of wonderful work with very out of control, difficult to manage children, and mainly work with parents. And so there's a type of treatment called PMT, or parent management training, for the acting out, oppositional, defiance, negativistic child or teen. More than what teenagers normally are, okay? This is like when it's really causing problems. And one of the principles she talks about there is called connection before correction. And connection before correction is a way to validate, I think, in lots of different spheres. It's not just when there's acting out behavior, but when you identify a problem, if you identify that, we have kids in our local community who travel to San Francisco or other parts of the North Bay because that's where their music teacher is. And that person is the most important person to them. They're like a mentor. They're the most amazing teacher. And that, you'll spend an hour for the lesson, but maybe 2 hours to commute each way, depending on where it is. And at some point, choices will have to be made around, like, if you have the formula, it may have to come down to that. It's just not adding up. It's like doing a budget. And if you get a sense that, I'm not sure, my child might be overscheduled, it might be on the bubble, or I think they're there, I think using one of the tools from Child Success might be what you have to do to really figure out, is this too much? I know she's really passionate about this. If this is the most important thing, then we may have to let something else go. And so then that's a very personal decision that the teenager should have a voice in, a very important voice. But you as the parent may have to make the tough call, certainly taking their really important perspective as number one in terms of the influence, but ultimately it has to be your decision. And sometimes the greatest therapeutic tool we can give as mental health people is empowering the parent to make the choice. I think teens have to feel like they are heard and they are listened to, but ultimately sometimes the grown-up has to make an unpopular decision.
Yeah. Okay, we've been talking about highly engaged, overscheduled kids, but what about kids who choose to do nothing but play video games? This is a real question, and don't engage socially with their friends. And there's another question that says, well, how do you differentiate a child that's sort of isolating themselves versus a kid who's sort of quiet and independent or introverted by nature. And I think the two kind of are connected. So what do you do with the kid who really isn't engaging socially with friends, and maybe is it okay to be an introvert? How do you differentiate that?
Look, I don't have the answers for this, but I do think what you said in the very beginning is that people interact in different ways. And actually, I worry a lot about people who are only interacting via the internet. Because like you said, people only show the happy times, and that's not normal interaction. I might be concerned about someone like that. I would try and get them in some activity, be it a church group or a music group or some type of activity group. Get them involved in interacting with other kids and limit the amount of screen time if you can.
I mean, I think that's a question we get asked a lot, is sort of how much screen time is okay. I mean, I had a mom say to me, like, is playing Call of Duty for 3 hours a day, does that seem too much? He's got a friend who plays 5, so we feel like we're looking pretty good at 3 hours. And, a part of this is like your bodies weren't made to sit. They're in the workplace now. This is why people have standing desks and like treadmill desks and stuff. Like, our bodies were not supposed to just sit and do this for hours and hours upon a time. Even on an airplane, you're supposed to get up and walk around, right? So just from a physical standpoint of sitting that long, it's just not healthy. But for many kids, it is social, and they've got their headsets on, and they're playing with so-and-so down the street and so-and-so down the street, and they'll give you that argument. And I'm okay with that for a little bit, but at some point you want live face-to-face interaction between children. And that is to read facial cues, that's to understand affect. There's no tone in texting. And just doing this and shooting and blowing people up for 4 hours a day is probably not leading to the kind of empathy that we want in this world. There's good studies actually that show that. So I would say you have to monitor the screen time. You want to encourage physical activity. You want to encourage face-to-face. But there are some kids who are just kind of more introverted, so they don't have to go. I have a mom who said, well, my kid has never gone on a date in high school, and she's never gone to a party. And I said, well, does she have a friend? Because you really just need one. Yeah, she has a friend, yeah. They don't really hang out all that much on weekends, but they Google chat each other and, do homework together. If you've got a friend, you don't have to go to, it's okay. Some people are not party people. Some people are introverted. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, that's fine. You've heard a lot of mnemonics here. No, that's okay.
You can totally disagree with me,
No,
Neville.
that's fine. You've heard a lot of mnemonics, so you've got lots of, and I see some people writing down things, but again, the American Academy of Pediatrics has a mnemonic 5210. 5 is servings of fruits and vegetables. Okay, that's good. 2 is screen time, 2 hours of screen time. So they recommend that there shouldn't be more than 2 hours of screen time. 1 is 1 hour of physical activity, also important for mental health. And 0 is sweetened beverages. So put that aside.
And how many friends do you need?
1.
Seriously?
One good one.
One good friend. One good friend.
I
So
think-
your kid doesn't have to be popular, and you
yeah.
shouldn't get caught up in that whole are we popular? Well, it's not about you, mom, dad, whoever.
I think where it gets hard is if you're a parent and you see that your child is suffering. Like, they're introverted and all these people are going out without them. The friends that used to be their friends are no longer their friends. And sometimes it's very hard to know, well, how do I introduce them to a new group, because I'm not at school. They're introverts and I'm not sure how to, and so we had an example of that. Again, I think some of the astute counselors in school, again, back to school, I think as parents, we have to be brave enough to be able to bring this, to get out of our own shame and stigma or shell or whatever it is, or worry, nightmare scenario that somehow this is going to end up, introverted, shy child is going to end up on the transcript or in the letter going to college. But, like, parents worry about these things. They worry about we worry about everything, right? That's why we're parents. But I do think that sometimes there is a role for, there are things you can do in the community, there are social skills groups, there are things that sometimes can help. But sometimes in schools, for example, in middle school, when some of the temperamental issues start to present themselves, kids begin to really have to navigate the social landscape. They have to go to many different classes. There are these nuances that they have to do in seconds. They have to figure out if they're cool with this group, if they can sit at that table. There's just a lot of things going on at once. And boys in particular usually are a little late to the game compared to girls. And sometimes, again, the counselor might be able to introduce them to a club that they didn't know about, for example, where there might be other kids who they might know, or they may, sometimes a guidance counselor knows who hangs out with whom. And that is sometimes the link. And we have found that again, that in your role as a parent, in middle school, you still got a chance, As a parent, they don't call security detail on you when you're on campus, like when you're in high school without a visitor pass, You have to have a reason to be there, and everyone's worried that there's some problem. But in middle school, the window is still kind of open. And now a lot of communities are doing this transition to high school, these transition to high school nights, where they have a night for 8th grade parents who are about to have their kids go to high school for the first time, and for 5th grade parents to go to 6th, or whatever the case may be in your community. And those are starting now. Like, we did some of those in the fall for basically parents of new freshmen. But a lot of communities are getting the message that we got to start that transition early. So, like, we're going to one for transition to high school next week for one of our kids. So I think that's a good place to ask some of those questions. What if I have a shy kid and I'm worried they're not going to be connected? What happens? And most of these places have these kinds of orientation events to get the kids acculturated and acclimated to the transition.
Great. Okay, there are 2 questions here that are related. One says, I'm just reading the question, don't get mad at me. As educators, how do we get parents to back off, as they are often driving the "but you have to do this in order to get into a good high school or college" kind of line? Parents want lots of extra activities, they want tough classes for good academic results, and most of them are not here tonight listening to you. So, right? We sort of, if you cared enough to come to this particular thing, you're probably not the super uber crazy parent driving this educator crazy. That question is related to, what do we say to our kids who don't want to ratchet back their commitments because they watch their peers who continue on the burnout track achieve and be rewarded with acceptance to these schools? So I'll answer this for a little bit, which is, there's a lot of kids out there who are going to get into XYZ school that, and you don't know the reasons. So they might be a legacy, they might have a big check written, they might be an athlete, or they might be a kid who is taking 5 AP classes, and it's a rare kid who can take 5 AP classes and do a sport and get 9 hours of sleep. I know a couple of those kids, and a couple of them ended up at Stanford. And that's kind of who belongs at Stanford, that really rare 1% who can kind of do it, enjoy it, do it for the right reasons, and get to sleep. Our kids probably aren't those kids, and that's okay. But so this idea of, well, everyone else is doing it and they don't have to, cut back, is really up to you as the parent to say, at what cost? Right? At what cost? I'm not willing to do what has to be done on the crazy track if it means a sacrifice of sleep and health and stress. And not just stress for the kid, because a stressed out kid is stressing the whole family unit out. So we make hard choices in life, but a lot of it is this misconception that where you go to school is connected to your success. And I want to quote Frank Bruni, which is a book that everybody should read, and he's coming to Palo Alto at the Jewish Community Center. I don't know the date, but I just saw the flyer. Frank Bruni wrote a book called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, full of a ton of research that shows you can go to a whole host of colleges and be successful. We know that in our bones because many of us didn't go to XYZ school, and we're successful, right? And it's not different today. People say, well, it's different today. It's not different today, right? And they'll say, well, Google only hires people from 16 schools. No, they used to do that, and they realized that, boy, that was a mistake, because brilliant people from the University of Kentucky and the University of Rochester were coming up with things that their Google employees weren't coming up with. And so now they hire from all over because they want the best person, and it's not related to where that person necessarily went to school. People went to school in Kansas City because their mom was sick or their boyfriend was going. They turned down Yale to go to Kansas City, and guess what? They are as successful. There's study after study that shows this. So you have to believe it. And I don't know how many times I can say it. I had an argument with someone who just kept saying, I just don't believe it. He kept saying, I hear what you're saying. I showed him the research. He read the research. I still don't believe it. I don't know what to do about that except to say, at what cost? What are you willing to put your kid through on the slim chance that they're going to get in? And on the even slimmer chance that they're going to stay and be happy, look at the kid who got into his reach school, versus the enjoyment of their entire childhood and the health and well-being of this individual who has one body that has to last them their entire life. I think the odds are go for health. So educate, educate, educate. Educators, you have to educate the parents. Parents, you got to back off and listen. Kids, you've got to say, you know what, blame it on me. My mom's not letting me take 5 APs. She had me fill out this stupid form that some lady on a panel told her to fill out, and she won't sign off on it, and so I can't take it, right? And I've said to my own children, you know, and you can come back to me years from now, and you can say, you know, why didn't you let me do X? And we'll put it in a letter and we'll seal it. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I want you to come back to me and we'll have this discussion. But right now, I'm the mom. This is the family decision. You're not taking 5 APs. Okay, that went over well.
I also think it's actually helpful for parents to learn how schools, how colleges make their decisions as well.
Good.
And it's a crapshoot, actually, in many situations, right?
Yeah, it is. No.
It is, often.
So, okay, I will tell this. Stanford University, right? How many applicants do they have that are perfectly qualified, 100% qualified, they would love to have in their class? 75% of their applicants are 100% qualified. They would love to have them come to Stanford, and they can take less than 5%. So that's not to scare you. That's to say, oh my gosh, 75% are qualified. All those people are going to go to a whole bunch of other schools that maybe my kid will also go to and have peers who are equally engaged and motivated. And guess what? The really good professors at the top schools that you think of as top schools are not dying fast enough to say that only the brilliant people end up at those 20 schools. Right? They're not dying. So like our most brilliant PhD students are going to the University of Kentucky. I feel like I'm picking on Kentucky. There's nothing wrong with it. And Rochester and Rutgers and Earlham and Elon and you know, I can name a whole bunch of schools. Brilliant professors, brilliant kids, motivated, engaged kids with really great programs. So do your homework, right? They're just not dying fast enough at the Harvards.
And I think, I think the other part of that is working with your schools, with the PTA and with the alumni, so that you have kids coming back to be on panels to talk about, boy, I thought some of these things were so important, they weren't so important, you know?
Yes.
I am at the school, I am so happy. I didn't get into my REIT school 2, 3, 4, or 5. I went to school like 17. I love that place. Teens are so completely, you know, they're loyal and they really see through the BS. So if they hear from their alumni, that's going to have a lot of validity for them. And so try to get a very diverse group to come back for that panel so that they can hear in their older peers' own words what the journey's been like for them and what is the advice that they give to their younger peers. And some of that has to be, what I would say about that, since we've done some of that, is whomever's organizing that has to have some kind of coordinated messaging with those kids. Right. Because you don't just want to bring them in and just let them go to town and say what they're going to say. There has to be some kind, you know, and there should be a diversity of voice there, right? There should be a voice for people who are really motivated, who take lots of classes. There should be a voice for people who don't do that, and people in between. The idea is to give our students a sense that there's lots of different pathways, and I think Frank Bruni and Denise are leaders in this area to talk about all these different pathways to get to success.
Okay, these are some important questions about confidentiality, and I think it's good for both counselors and parents to hear this. So this is from a school counselor. When discussing drugs, substance abuse, even suicidality, ideation, what pushes the limits of confidentiality? For school counselors and other mandated reporters, what guidance can you provide for when to report or engage a parent and a health provider? So I think that's good for parents to hear too, so you know what can be done. So I don't know, Neville?
So the question is about confidentiality about what?
About when discussing drugs or substance abuse or suicide ideation.
Okay. There are different laws in different states, obviously. Certainly from our point of view as a physician, it might be different for a guidance counselor. We offer confidentiality in asking those questions. With
So
sexuality,
you're not going to tell a parent, in other words.
I'm not going to tell a parent unless with depression, right? When I'm offering the confidentiality, I always leave the door open saying, unless you're going to tell me you're going to hurt yourself or hurt someone else, in which case I'm going to speak with your parent, but I wouldn't do that without speaking to you first. Those are my ground rules. So there is confidentiality, but when we're talking about hurting yourself or hurting someone else, we have to speak to a parent, and we have to try and get a mental health professional as well. Drugs, not necessarily. The truth is a lot of your kids are using drugs.
This is so depressing sometimes.
But most of them, what's important, most of them are experimenting, and most of them, and 99% of them, are going to be successful people and will get through their adolescence the same way as you did, right?
That's good.
But that's important. But what we do is we can counsel, we can be proactive with that, and obviously advise them not to and how to protect themselves. But so drugs, not necessarily. If it's drugs getting in the way of other things, now we're crossing over that line.
Yeah, and I would say our thresholds has to do with safety. So I sometimes we're often that explicit and say this is confidential with some caveats, and I have a safety concern about you. That safety concern might involve their own health because something bad might happen to them or is happening to them. So if there's a potential abuse situation, or if they're going to run away, if I'm worried about that. So that's not necessarily imminent harm to themselves or others, but running away could be a safety issue. I leave it general enough so that I don't pigeonhole myself too much, because I need to give myself some flexibility. As a psychiatrist, of course, when it comes to potential risk of harming oneself, I have to decide how imminent that is, and we have some liberty there around when we can bend confidentiality, because the golden rule is safety always trumps confidentiality, and in general we have a lot of protection. There are a lot of statutes and a lot of precedent around that, but sometimes it's hard to know. And one of the most frustrating things for parents is after their teenager turns 18, suddenly they feel like all their rights are gone. Parents feel like now they're 18 and they've forbidden the emergency room doctor to talk with me. That's very hard. And there are emergency room docs, again, who will take some liberty with that, because usually they get it and they understand, and when it comes to safety, they will try in some ways to at least keep you informed. But that can be very difficult, and part of the issue has to do with the specific situation. So I like to couch it in terms of safety. When there's a potential safety risk, so when it comes to drug use and alcohol use, you have to be careful, because we don't want them to stop coming to us as the doctors or as the counselors to tell us the truth. If we know they're using and they're saying they're using twice a week, typically we double that and say, all right, they're using 2 to 4 times a week. But if they're saying that 2 to 4 times a week and they're driving, and then that, as Neville said, then we have to have a more in-depth conversation to really get a sense for, is this an imminent risk? Is this a potential risk? Could they kill themselves on the way home, not intentionally, but because they're high in my office? So some of those decisions, I think, again, will rely on our relationship with the teen. And then, of course, yes, I'm going to tell the teen, I'm really concerned, I want to bring your parent here. I know you don't want to, and I'm happy to talk to them, but either you need to tell them or I need to tell them, or we tell them together, but I'm very concerned about this. And I think that depends on the situation.
Well, this has been hugely educational for me as a mom. I think the best thing I heard tonight was that 99.9% of kids get through their adolescence healthy and make it through, just like everyone in the audience. And I think we heard some really good strategies, a lot of acronyms, a lot of PDFs and whatever nines, and people wrote them down. We will be around to talk for a few more minutes individually, and if you have questions, but I think we're going to let the Common Ground representative take it from here. So thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.
So we want to thank our panel for sharing their insights tonight. It was really insightful, wonderful. And I'm sure we will continue to discuss this powerful, important topic after we leave. Common Ground has also purposefully scheduled our next events to help families learn tools to cope with stress and understand how to create balanced, happy lives at home. So please join us for Sonia Lubomirsky's talk on the science of happiness on February 2nd and February 3rd, and Alicia Goldstein's workshop on mindfulness meditation on February 4th. And also I want to remind you all to turn in your surveys as you leave. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. It went well. Yeah.